Okay, so today we're going to be looking at legislation and licenses. I'll pause on this slide. You can see there are three laws. They are missing the vowels, but you see if you can complete them. So the first one is the Data Protection Act. The middle one is the Computer Misuse Act. And the bottom one is the Copyright Designs and Patents Act. And this is what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at the three pieces of legislation along with software licenses themselves. So the two different types, the open source and proprietary software options in a bit more detail. I'll pause on this slide so you can have a quick read through. So firstly, just recapping from a previous lesson where we looked at the ethical considerations within computer science. And we touched on this already about the fact that there's lots of things that we need to consider when using computers and technology. And some of these will be down to a moral decision about things that are right or wrong. And some of them will be a bit more prescriptive, where things are stated in law about what we can, can't do. And we're going to look at some of the legislation that actually restricts us from being able to do certain things rather than necessarily our own opinions. So the Data Protection Act has been around for a number of years and more recently was updated to include some sort of additional bits and pieces. And this is that term GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation, was introduced a couple of years ago. And this was kind of to make it a bit more friendly for people to understand and give people a bit more power as well. And there are a few key principles. I've put 6 of these key principles on this slide. So the first thing is that personal data must be fairly and lawfully processed. Now, this is quite a straightforward sort of point. This is just a case that when you're using an organization or giving over personal details, that it needs to be treated fairly and lawfully. Now, lawfully is obviously quite a generic term, but it could well be a case that obviously it will need to comply with other legislation. The second bullet point then, personal data must be obtained for a specified, explicit and legitimate purpose. And this is about the idea that actually when we are looking to take people's personal data for a particular use, it is for that use. We're not collecting data to market them without their permission or anything like that. It's a case that we are collecting that data because we need it to operate our business. Bullet point 3, personal data must be adequate, relevant and not excessive. And this kind of links to the previous point in some respects where we're saying obviously that it's a case that we are collecting what's appropriate. Point 4, personal data must be accurate and up to date. And this is that idea obviously that we are doing everything that we can as an organization to ensure that actually when you do give us data, we're keeping it as clear as they're accurate and up to date. So if we provide you with if you were to provide a company with a new phone number, for example, they would do their best to make sure that it does get updated. Personal data is kept for no longer than is necessary. Now, this is the idea that obviously if you were to no longer be dealing with a company, there's no requirement for them to continue to keeping your data. So if you've ended a subscription, for example, and you don't want your information stored with them anymore, you've got the right to have that removed. And personal data must be handled in a way that ensures security. And this is the idea, obviously, that whilst all these companies may have all this data and they may be having this data for legitimate and reasonable means, it's a case that they're doing everything that they can to make it secure. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily about the fact of saying that it's 100% fail-safe and no one's going to be able to get your data, but it's all about making sure that they put the necessary restrictions in place to do everything that's within their powers to make sure that it is kept secure. And the Computer Misuse Act is kind of from the other side of the coin. So the Data Protection Act is about organizations making sure that they're protecting your data, making sure that obviously they're doing everything that they can to keep it secure. Well, the Computer Misuse Act is designed to discourage people from using computers for illegal purposes. This is the idea that it's going to restrict them from being able to try and do anything illegal on the other side of this. So this might be preventing people from trying to access that data. So there's a few key principles with this as well. So you must not access data stored on a computer unless you have permission. And this is that idea that obviously whilst the company is going to do everything they can to protect your data, this also then prevents and stops an external user trying to access data. And it's not necessarily always even external users. It could be an internal user. It could be, for example, that I might be trying to access another teacher's data stored on a computer at school, and I shouldn't be doing that. That's me misusing the computer. Bullet point 2, you must not access data on a computer to use it for further illegal purposes, such as fraud and blackmail. There are other examples as well, but the idea is that you're not gaining that data or accessing that data with the intent to abuse it. You must not alter data on a computer without permission, and this includes through software such as malware. Now, what we mean by this is I can't go on and change student details without permission. So it's a case, for example, like we said in the example where someone's given us a phone number to update, I'm doing that with permission. If it's a case, for example, I know that there's a new phone number for that student, I can't just go on and change it. It doesn't quite work like that. It has to be consensual. And equally, this kind of protects or covers software. So the fact that if you create a virus or some malware that's going to go in and edit someone's data, this is where the protection legally comes from. And equally, this introduces the protection about hacking as well. So you must not hack or attempt to gain unauthorized access to data which you're not entitled to. So it's this piece of law which will actually stop someone from going into a computer, hacking and stealing your data. They can be prosecuted under the Computer Misuse Act. The Copyright Designs and Patent Act of 1988. So this is where we're looking at protecting something that someone's created, which while sounds very generic, I'll go through some examples of this as well. So this could be things like pictures. So that might well be photographs that someone's taken. It might be artwork that they've created, any sort of imagery that they're producing. Videos, as we know, self-explanatory, that includes films. It could be music videos. It could be any content from YouTube that you're creating that is protected. Sounds, that's audio files, music, those sorts of things. And games being things like computer games that you might play on a games console such as PlayStation or Xbox or so forth. And when you're buying any of these sorts of things, be it some artwork, a film, some songs or a game, what you're buying is a license to use that item. So for example, when you buy a game, you're buying that disc which has a physical copy of that game. However, what you're paying the money for is not necessarily the physical piece of plastic that the disc is stored within or so forth. It's the actual rights to play that game or listen to that song or watch that film, for example. And there are a few principles in this act, and to keep it quite simple. So in short, you can't make copies of any of the material. So once you buy a song, a film, or anything like that, it's illegal for you to make a copy of any of the content. With that, it's also illegal for you to publish it. So in that respect, if, for example, you bought a new film on Blu-ray, for example, you can't then make a copy of it, store it to your computer, and then post it on YouTube. That would be illegal to do so. And equally, you're not able to sell it on. And again, you mustn't distribute. So it's quite straightforward. Realistically, what we're saying is if you were to buy a creation that someone's made, you're not able to make a copy of it, publish it, sell it, distribute it, try and pass it off as your own, that sort of thing. Generally speaking, it's for your personal use, and that's it. You couldn't, in theory, buy a copy of a game, make 20 copies of it, give it all to your friends, and let them play as well. And when we talk about software licenses, so we spoke about the fact that we're buying a license that's personal to us. There are different considerations with licenses. So when you buy software for your computer, as I mentioned, you're buying that software for yourself or for your device. And it's a case that obviously, if you wanted to use multiple copies of that software, you'd need to buy multiple licenses. But there are some considerations. Not all software has this same structure of licensing. And it's not always a case that you're going to pay for software. There's lots and lots of software out there that is freely available, which can quite often do just as good a job as something you might pay for. And there are two main types. We've got proprietary software and open source software. And we'll look at the two types side by side. So firstly, proprietary software is often legislated or governed by the copyright law, and it requires a license for you to use. So you might go out and pay for this. This is what we might refer to as off-the-shelf software, where you might be able to walk into a shop, pick it up, buy it at the till, take it home, and then use it. And this might be relevant for things like games or applications on your computers. And there's lots of things that you might want to consider when you're looking at software, particularly proprietary software. So we're going to go through some advantages and disadvantages, and I'll just sort of touch on these very briefly. So some of the advantages, quite often when you buy proprietary software, they're from massive organizations. So for example, Microsoft Office. So Microsoft Word, if we sort of simplify it a bit further, is generally going to be bug-free. It's a case that you're not going to be using it and expecting it to be crashing or having any issues with the software. And you'll find that quite regularly there'll be updates as well. So you may have seen, if you've used any of these sorts of packages, that you'll get feature updates, you'll get additional tools built into the applications, and this makes it last that bit longer. And you also find that if there are issues with the software or you've got anything that you need help with, that you can get support directly from the manufacturer, so to speak. So if we use Microsoft Office as an example again, if you need some support, Microsoft Office will provide you directly with support because you've paid for that product. And therefore, you've got some rights to expect it to be able to work. And equally, there's a lot more support from the wider community because they tend to be packages that are more widely used. And you can kind of find that out quite easily when you look for things on video sites like YouTube, or when you Google certain things, that there'll be a lot more support from things like Microsoft or other companies as well. But there are disadvantages to consider. So, for example, the fact that, as we mentioned already, proprietary software can have quite high upfront costs, or potentially on a subscription basis, as is becoming more common when you look at some of the Adobe suites. So things like Photoshop and so forth are quite often moving to this monthly subscription idea now, rather than paying a lump sum up front. But either way, there are quite often costs involved. A further disadvantage is that the software, when you buy it, does what it does and it can't be adapted. There's no way that you're able to change any of the code for that. You can't customize it or edit it. You can change settings, but you're not able to reprogram it by accessing the source code. And again, the licensing involved with these pieces of software might cause you to have restrictions in the way that you use that software. As I mentioned, when you buy this license, you might be buying a singular license for personal use rather than for the wider organization. When we look at open source software, there are other things to consider. So open source software is generally free when it comes to using it. So there's quite often no cost associated, and there's little copyright. Now, open source software kind of is exactly what it says on the tin. It's open source, meaning you can access the code. You're able to edit the code and reprogram it. There are some things to consider when you do that, though. When you do edit the code, be sure that you were to always credit the original creator of the application. And it would just be a case that you would potentially update, tweak, and so forth, and then republish it back to the internet so that other people can see and use your amendments. And so open source software has, again, advantages and disadvantages. I will run through those briefly. So advantages, generally there is no cost associated with open source software. They're quite often freely available. The access to the source code is quite helpful. If you've got the expert knowledge, you're able to then edit that program so that it can do exactly what you want it to do to fit your exact needs. You've got multiple developers, meaning it can continually be improved. So as we mentioned, with the source code being available, lots and lots of different people could be working on it to improve it, build new versions of it, tweak things. And there's very few limitations on the use of this software. So you're able to use it on a number of devices without much issue, provided obviously that it works nice and smoothly. It's a case that you're not going to be hampered by having to buy a license for every single individual device. But there are disadvantages, and some of these can be significant. So there's no guarantee that there won't be bugs in the program. So in that being said, with it being freely and openly available and you can edit the code, it only takes a case for there to be something to be published with an error in the code, and it could potentially have massive impacts on the way that you use that software. There's no single point of contact when support's needed. Because there's no mass organization running necessarily the software, and it might be a community-made project, when it comes to an issue with the program, you've not necessarily got someone to go to. And if you can even go to someone, because they're not necessarily generating any money from this, they may not see it as a priority to come and sort that problem. And there's limited support from the community if the software is not widely used. And what we mean by that is, if you're using open source software and it's not been adopted by lots and lots of people, you're not going to be able to find much in the way of forums or videos giving you some guidance and support. So there are some real considerations. And when we're looking at open source versus proprietary, companies need to consider their needs. So for example, if it's a case that you're running your accounts and you've got all of your business running through your open source software and it fails and you lose all of that data, that can have significant costs. Where actually, if you were using some open source software and you had some high level of support and a low chance of bugs, it might well be worthwhile investing the money in upfront in that software, kind of in a means of ensuring the fact that you're not going to have problems. It's considerations that you need to take depending on the needs of your users. And here are some examples of proprietary and open source software. There are lots and lots more of these. Here's just a couple. So Windows and Apple operating systems, OS X, Mac OS, are two examples of proprietary pieces of software. They generally have a cost, whilst Linux is an example of a free operating system. You've got Office So Microsoft Office is a proprietary format, and OpenOffice, and there are other different types of Office open source alternatives, but these are just to give you some examples. Proprietary, again, Adobe Photoshop, a paid for licensed product, but there is a version of the software called GIMP, which is very similar to Photoshop and will give you a lot of the functionality that Photoshop has, but perhaps with slightly less support out there. And things like console games, another example of paid for software that falls under the proprietary category, whilst things like the Firefox web browser is completely open source.